Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Gunter, and I'm one of the directors here at Brain Balance Achievement Centers. And I just want to welcome you guys tonight to this presentation. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the brain and sensory processing. Now, as we are presenting tonight, talking about sensory processing, we will be having some polls that we would love for you to participate in. The more that you answer and give me feedback, it allows me to be able to speak to the audience that's in front of me. So our first question tonight is this your first time being at one of our webinars? We offer webinars each month on different hot topics, and sensory processing is a hot topic, especially because it's the holiday season. Right? And so there's a lot that goes on when the schedules are different, the activities are different. There's so much more going on that can be fun, but that can also create situations and circumstances where it's not so fun. So we felt like this was a good topic to enter the holiday season with. So sure enough, 74% of you guys are brand new to our webinar. So again, welcome so much. We're excited that you're here tonight. And we are going to be answering questions. And then also we have several centers participating in this webinar tonight. So we have centers in California, Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And there are texting numbers in the comments. So if you have a specific question about your child, look for the center that's nearest you and go ahead and text them individually. We also have moderators on tonight that will be answering questions. So if you write a question in the comment chat, they will be happy to answer those questions. And then at the end, I'm going to also answer some questions live. So there's lots of ways for you to interact tonight, and we want this to be interactive. I don't want you just to be listening to me talking. We want you to interact and engage with us tonight. So feel free, ask questions, and please participate in our polls. So I always love to start with, what is sensory processing? There's lots of different discussions about it, but the bottom line is the definition of sensory processing is the effective registration and accurate interpretation of sensory input in the environment, including one's body. It's the way that the brain receives, organizes, and responds to sensory input in order to behave in a meaningful and consistent manner. Let's dive a little bit deeper. First, I want to ask you, though, a poll question. Does your child have a formal diagnosis of sensory processing disorder, generalized anxiety, autism, other, or maybe they're not even diagnosed, but yet you have some concerns and you're seeing some things that you're not quite for sure what it is, but it has gotten you to a webinar tonight talking about sensory processing. Oftentimes we have children and young adults and even adults that come in and not only have symptoms of sensory processing, but there can be other symptoms as well. ADHD, of course, anxiety is a big one. And the reason anxiety is a big one is, think about it, when you're struggling with processing senses from what you hear, what you see, what you smell, what you feel, oftentimes it creates anxiety because you're just not quite for sure when it's going to happen, what's going to happen. And so many times we hear that anxiety is also something that someone or a child can be struggling with. So sure enough, you guys are saying 44% are no, there's no formal diagnosis. And yet 24% says other, 15% says autism. We've got 18% with general anxiety and 17% with sensory processing. So that's interesting that many of you guys are here and you don't have a formal diagnosis. So let's dive a little bit deeper into talking about sensory processing. So just like I shared, sensory processing is the brain's ability to take in and be able to process all of our senses, what we see, hear, smell, and feel. Then we have what we call hypersensitivity, where they're oversensitive to stimuli, where it's easy to become overwhelmed in different places when there's lots of people, lots of noises, different lights going on. They can be sensitive to bright lights and visual clutter. Oftentimes, when a child or a young adult is struggling with hypersensitivity, they prefer soft clothing versus like jeans that can be scratchy or can be really tight on them. They really can't avoid hugs because, again, many times they may not like being touched. They can gag, vomit on certain smells or certain textures of food. And then they can even startle suddenly by making noises or by having noises being made. It could be as easy as a school bell, it could be a fire drill bell, or it could just be a loud noise that just happens accidentally. But that can be something that a child or a young adult can struggle with. Or being at a restaurant, right, where there's loud music playing, there's lots of people there. Oftentimes, a child that's struggling with sensory processing and hypersensitivity specifically can have those types of symptoms. Even in adults, just this week, I was talking to an adult who was struggling with sensory processing. And she was just saying how it has also created so much anxiety because she is scared to get in the car. She doesn't know and can't predict what's going on around her when she goes to a mall and there's lots of people and lots of noises. She can break out into a sweat. Her heart rate can start hitting really high and rapid heart rate. And she said, you know, it feels uncontrollable. And so because it's uncontrollable, now she also has anxiety of not wanting to go out in public. And so many times, you know, when a child is struggling with sensory processing, it's something that is uncontrollable. They can't help it. And tonight we're going to talk about why, and we can also talk about what's going on in the brain of a child that's struggling, or a young adult or an adult that's struggling with sensory processing. So we have hypersensitivity. Okay. And then we have hypo-sensitivity, where they can be undersensitive to stimuli. Some examples of that would be bedwetting, where they don't feel that their bladder is full, or they can squeeze too hard, or they can hurt pets because they squeeze too hard, or they can be just too rough with them. Oftentimes, they are risk takers, where they're constantly taking risks. There's no fear because, again, they're having difficulty with body awareness and knowing their body in space. They can easily trip, bump into things, but even if they fall, and they can even have, you know, blood running down their legs, they may not feel it. So it can be a symptom where you feel like there's a high pain tolerance taking place. They can struggle with keeping their hands to themselves. They always want squeezes or deep hugs. Or you notice as a parent that if they're really hyper and they're really struggling, if you hold them in your lap and you're squeezing them tight, it actually calms them down. That is a sign and a symptom of hyposensitivity. So we have hypersensitivity and we have hyposensitivity, and yet there can be signs of overload and also related to unprovoked crying. They can be disoriented and confused. They cover their eyes, they cover their ears, they can hum loudly, they can rock back and forth because they can't handle the noise that's going on around them. They can complain of stomach aches and feeling nauseous. Also, too, you can see a flushed face, you can see clammy hands, dilated eyes. Rapid heart rate is also something that you can see and observe. And then when we're looking at sensory seeking, these are, again, that hyposensitivity where they're space invaders. They need the cuddle, they need the squeezes, they want the flapping of the arms or bouncing or spinning, or they're chewing on clothes or pencils. And again, they just want to feel the rush. They want to break rules. They want to go the extreme oftentimes. And even self-harm can be a sign and a symptom of hyposensitivity to sensory input. So here's a question for you. Do you feel like your child or young adult is struggling with symptoms of hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, or do you see signs of both? And I'll talk about perhaps why you may see some signs of both. And then the next question is does this limit you from being able to do fun activities with your family, because your child may become irritable and overwhelmed, and so a fun activity becomes no fun any longer because it's impacting your daily life. So sure enough, you guys are saying you're seeing signs of both. 59% are saying they're seeing signs of both. And 60% of you are saying, yes, this is impacting our ability to have fun. When we look at how is this affecting home life? Well, many times parents say to us that it's impacting home life in the relationship between their siblings, that oftentimes they don't have a good relationship with their siblings, or your other children can easily get frustrated. Many times we hear parents say that, I feel like we're always focused on our one child that's struggling. And it's almost like there's a persona that they're the problem child. It can impact marriage because, again, you guys are trying to constantly be walking on eggshells and trying to be able to eliminate meltdowns. Many times I'll hear parents say that, we can't even do things together as a family. One spouse is with the child that's struggling, the other spouse is with the other children, that oftentimes you have to split up and not be able to do everything as one family unit. I had a family just share with me recently that their daughter can't handle chewing, right? And that chewing bothers her so much that she just can't handle sitting with the family at dinner. And so she chooses to eat in her room because she can't handle the chewing of other people. So those are things that can really impact home life. Of course, the meltdowns that are creating tension and an unhappy environment. And then, of course, the anxiety of having to predict and set things up to where you're avoiding meltdowns, or you're avoiding having to go to places that are requiring, all of that sensory input. Of course, at school, if a child is struggling at school when it comes to sensory processing, it can cause them to not be able to learn, because many times when the brain is struggling with processing their auditory system, their visual system, perhaps having to write down information, all of that is multisensory processing. And so when the brain is struggling with multisensory processing, it can impact learning. And their brain can also shift into survival mode, where they're functioning out of fight, flight, or freeze versus being able to reason and critically think. And so if that nervous system becomes dysregulated and they function out of fight, flight, or freeze, then definitely learning is not happening. And so even in freeze mode, the child may not be having a meltdown, but they're also not processing the information that they're supposed to be learning. Many times when you have that, it's because there's an overwhelmed sense of the sensory processing that's taking place. And then also it impacts social life, because think about it. When you have a child that's sensitive, they're going to be roughhousing. They're going to be rough with friends. And then are they able to accept when a friend says, stop, or you're hurting me, or take a step back, you're in my space? Oftentimes kids that are sensory seeking, they don't really understand that. And so it really can impact friendships. But then also, if you have a child that is easily overwhelmed, they're not the ones that want to go out in public. They want to stay home. They may want to stay in their room. You may be concerned about how much time they're spending in their room. If they're struggling at school, and they're under the desk or they're having meltdowns, that's where kids are going to start looking at them and wondering what's wrong with them and why are they acting this way. And you can hear, kids call them names. Those are things that are really hard to hear and really challenging. And then, of course, as they become teenagers and young adults, you can have the fear of driving. You can have failure to launch, where you're not going to see those independent skills as much because of the anxiety related to sensory processing. And of course, then that's going to impact their ability to maintain a job and have a career. So especially right now, going into the holiday season, right? Here we just finished at the end of October with Halloween and all of the costumes and difficulties maybe with wearing masks, or difficulties with face paint or certain costumes, or of course, all of the holiday gatherings where lots of family members are coming together, or you're doing special events because of the fall weather. All of these things that are supposed to be fun and creating memories, right? When you have a child that's struggling with sensory processing, a fun experience can go no fun real fast. And that's something that we hear often. Even in adults, we can have adults that struggle with sensory processing. Again, it will impact their focus and follow through because it impacts cognition and reasoning skills. It will definitely impact their social life. They will avoid stimulation. So they will avoid parties, they will avoid outings. And then thinking about adult relationships, if they're touch avoidant, or they, struggle with having loud discussions, or again, just creating stress because their body's in a state of stress. And so this is creating stress in the home. And then of course it can impact the way your parenting style is, right? Because if you're touch avoidant, that can impact bonding. If you're smell avoidant, that's going to impact the foods maybe that you're feeding your child. And then you can become easily overwhelmed. And that's something that can be challenging when you have children. I had a gentleman a few months ago share with me, he was an adult, and he said that he was even struggling with taking a shower because the water coming out of the shower head was so agitating that he couldn't do it any longer, that he had gotten to a place where he couldn't even take a shower, or he couldn't even wash his hair. And so these are things that, again, can become very debilitating over time. So here's a question for you. Where are you seeing your child or young adult struggle the most? Is it in home life, school life, social life, or all of the above? How significant do you feel like the impact of your child's struggles are, or maybe it's you that is struggling? And then does the holiday season tend to be more challenging for you and your child or your teen or young adult due to sensory struggles? Because this is definitely the season where we hear more and more of families that are struggling with their child related to sensory processing, because there's so many different things that go on during the holiday season. And then that really creates a lot of stress on top of how just general holidays can be stressful, right? But when you have a child or an adult or a young adult that's struggling, it can even become more stressful. So for sure enough, you guys are saying that over 50% of you guys are saying that all of the above, that it's impacting home life, school life, and social life. And then many of you guys are saying that let's see, 31% says 4, 31% says 3, 27% says 5. And then definitely 53% of you guys are saying yes, this is impacting the holiday season. So, so thank you for giving me that input. So now let's talk about what's really going on. Why are you seeing the struggles that you're seeing? And here's what the research says is that when you see difficulties with behavior, focus, memory retention, academics, life skills, social skills, difficulties with sensory processing, that it basically comes down to a lack of brain connectivity. A lack of brain connectivity. And let's talk about what does that mean? Well, first, okay, when we think about the nervous system, all right, the brain is the main organ for your nervous system, all right, and you have a parasympathetic and a sympathetic nervous system, meaning that when you're in a state of rest and digest and your nervous system's in a place of calm, you're functioning out of more of parasympathetic, where you're able to reason, critically think, process your senses appropriately, be able to just enjoy life, right? And then we have sympathetic. Now, here's the thing. It's good that we have both, that we have parasympathetic and we have sympathetic, right? Because when you're in a dangerous situation, all right, your little nervous system needs to go into sympathetic mode, right? It's called fight, flight, or freeze. It's survival. All right. So fight means you're going to approach and go after something. Flight means you're getting the heck out of there. Freeze means you're staying still and you're not moving. But here's the thing. Oftentimes, children, adults, that struggle with sensory processing, all right, they can easily shift from parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, and they're in a place of calm, to their nervous system shifting into sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze. That's when you can have the clammy hands, the dilated eyes, the flushed face, and they're responding out of a place of stress. Their nervous system is in a place of stress. And we're going to talk about why that is. So I always love to show a picture of an iceberg because a picture is 1,000 words, okay? And when we're thinking about the iceberg and we're thinking about the tip of the iceberg, all right, I want you to think about your child or your young adult or maybe yourself and all of the symptoms that I just described. What are those symptoms for your child? Because those are the visible symptoms that you are experiencing as a family, that your child is experiencing, and that you can visibly see. All right. Those are the symptoms. But just as I shared with you, that when we have symptoms of a weakness in sensory processing, it really comes down to connectivity in the brain, all right, or processing in the brain. And so for a child to be able to process their senses appropriately, they have to have optimal processing. All right, so optimal processing in their visual system, their auditory system, their ability to smell, their ability to feel. The goal is to have optimal processing in the brain. So you have to have appropriate sensory processing. You also have to have appropriate motor development, because senses develop the brain and motor develops the brain. Gross motor, fine motor. All right, but then you can see at the bottom, all right, you have all these visible symptoms at the top, but there's so much going on underneath that you may not see visibly. And that is, how is your child's brain processing? Okay, because when you have sensory processing difficulties, it's an indication that there's a weakness in processing in their brain. All right. And so then that's when we have to look at, all right, where are their strengths in processing? And maybe there are some weaknesses and processing that's impacting that cross communication of the brain. We go all the way back to brain balance is a developmental model where we're looking at how is your child's brain developing and where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses. So we start by looking at what we call primitive reflexes or survival reflexes. These primitive reflexes, every baby's born with them. They facilitate in the birthing process because when your child is born and they're a baby, their brain isn't fully developed. And so you need these primitive reflexes because basically the only area of the brain that is developed is the emotional area of the brain. So if you think about a baby, when they are hungry, what do? They cry, right? Or when they need to be changed, what do? They cry, right? So all to say that the area of the brain that's developed in a baby is the emotional area of the brain. And so they don't have that reasoning skills yet and processing, optimal processing yet. So each baby is born with these primitive reflexes. All right. And they're survival reflexes. They're involuntary motor movements that get your babies moving. All right. Get them moving, and they're involuntary motor responses. But for example, you have what we call a startle reflex or a Moreau reflex. All right. Because the baby's pretty helpless, right? They're 100% reliable on the parent. Okay. And so all to say that when you think about a baby and they're in their car seat or they're in their carrier, or maybe they're just sleeping in a swing, and all of a sudden there's a loud noise that happens. All right. All of a sudden you'll see that that baby will startle and start crying because again, they're functioning out of parasympathetic, but then a loud noise happens. Okay. They startle because they have a survival reflex called the Moreau reflex or the startle reflex. And that awakens the baby, and the baby, their nervous system feels like it's in stress mode, right? And they start crying for someone to come, right? And that is appropriate, okay? Because it really helps with survival, all right? But here's the thing. Primitive reflexes are appropriate in babies, but as your child's brain is developing, all right, through their sensory systems and through their motor systems, all right, these primitive reflexes should mature and not be active any longer. Matter of fact, by 18 months of age, your child should not have active primitive reflexes. What's really interesting is that oftentimes children and adults that struggle with sensory processing, they can still have active primitive reflexes that can easily shift their nervous system from parasympathetic, which is rest and digest in a body that is calm, and their reasoning and critical thinking, and it can easily shift them into sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze, where it inhibits reasoning and critical thinking. It can cause a rapid heart rate. It can cause clammy hands, dilated eyes. It can cause their nervous system to go in stress mode. And then guess what happens? Their sensory systems are even heightened in that moment. All right. So you can see where they become more sensory sensitive in those moments where they're functioning out of fight, flight, or freeze. So literally just from primitive reflexes, your child can easily become dysregulated, all right, where their nervous system goes into a place of stress, they can't handle it, and then that's when you can see meltdowns, and that's when you can see even more oversensitivity taking place. All right. So often I try to encourage parents that, you know, your child really can't help when they're struggling with overstimulation and oversensory input because it is a neurological response. So that's something we have to consider is when we're looking at why is your child struggling or your young adult is struggling with sensory processing, we have to look at, do they have any primitive reflexes that's inhibiting development, that's inhibiting processing in the brain? And then we also have to look at, okay, how do they process their senses? What is their visual system, their auditory system, their motor systems, gross motor, fine motor? How can they feel their body? Can they smell? We really have to look at all of those senses. Where are their strengths? Because again, your child can have hyper, where they're above average in certain sensory systems, and then also there can be under connections in other areas. There also can be related to motor, gross motor, fine motor. So many times families can see concerns in sensory processing, but you also have to look at other areas of development. How are their gross motor skills? How are their muscle tone? Do they have good body awareness and balance and coordination? I often say to our parents, a coordinated body is a coordinated brain. And that's what we need. We need optimal processing in the brain. And so even thinking about your child's coordination and their ability to be able to play sports, do they like playing sports? Do they like playing outside? Those are all things to consider as well. And then of course we have gross motor, and then we have fine motor. So all of these things are really critical. They need to be all functioning optimally from their sensory systems, their motor systems, gross motor, fine motor, and also their primitive reflexes need to be inhibited to have optimal processing in the brain. All right. So here's a question for you. Has anyone explained to you the role of primitive reflexes and how it can impact the brain and sensory processing? That's question number one. Question number two is, do you feel like your child is functioning more out of their sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic? Are you seeing more of that emotional dysregulation, that sensory sensitivity, where they're oversensitive to tactile or auditory or anxiety? Because again, that will happen oftentimes when a child is struggling with sensory processing. They are functioning out of fight, flight, or freeze versus being able to reason and critically think. So sure enough, you guys are saying 73% of you guys have never heard about primitive reflexes and the impact of sensory processing. And then also 84% of you guys are saying, yes, I feel like we're functioning more out of sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So here's what that means is that oftentimes when we see an imbalance in skill sets, all right, it's an imbalanced brain, all right, where one area of the brain can be maturing faster and even can be functioning above average. And then you can have other areas of the brain that are functioning below average or that are underdeveloped. And so when you have underdevelopments and even overdevelopments, it impacts the cross communication of the brain. All right. I always say the balanced brain is a teachable brain. A connected brain is a teachable brain. So we have to look at things from a developmental perspective, but here's the thing, we have to look at things from a hemispheric perspective. You have the left hemisphere of the brain, you have the right hemisphere of the brain. And I want to describe both hemispheres because they have complementary functions, but they're also very different. All right. The left hemisphere, I often like to think of it as like a gas pedal. It's your processing hemisphere. All right. It's your go, go, go area of the brain. Okay. It's the ability to remember details, and verbal communication is housed in the left hemisphere. It's also about repetition and pattern recognition. So logical and linear thinking. All right. Oftentimes a child that has a strong left brain, they like patterns or they like things repetitious. You can also see some OCD type symptoms where they don't have that flexibility to do something different. All right, because the left hemisphere of the brain is about logical and linear thinking. It's also about IQ. It's also about auditory processing, visual processing. Academically, the left hemisphere of the brain is about, again, patterns, right? So numeration, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. When it comes to reading, it's about word reading, letter recognition, blends, learning how to read, spelling, grammar. So your left hemisphere is your go, go, go hemisphere. All right. It's also about detail. All right. So when you think about sensory processing and you think about a child that can hear something that nobody else can hear, or they have perfect pitch or perfect tone, I would say they have a very strong left brain. All right. Then we have the right hemisphere of the brain. And the right hemisphere of the brain is, I like to think of it as like the brake pedal of the brain, the ability to stop and think before acting. But here's the thing, your right hemisphere is about the modulation of sensory input. Okay, so it can dampen sensory input. It's definitely about being able to, if you think about it, if you're in a loud restaurant, okay, and you're able to have typical sensory processing and you're talking to someone at your table, have you ever noticed that basically the noise around you can become very dull and you can focus in on the person that you're talking to? The right hemisphere actually helps with that modulation of sensory input. The right hemisphere is also about the ability to physically feel your body. So tactile processing is housed in the right hemisphere. The ability to be flexible is very right brain. The ability to see the big picture, what we call global coherence, is very right brain. Also, when we're thinking about academics, it's about math comprehension, math word problems, reading comprehension, being able to read and learn from what they're reading. All right. Also, the right hemisphere is all about social skills and social and emotional development. All right. So reading facial expressions and really understanding the social dynamics in situations is very much more of a right hemispheric function. The reality is you need both hemispheres of the brain. They need to be equally developing. They need to be constantly communicating. And we need to be creating strong neural pathways, or what I like to call highway systems in the brain. You know, we all have been in traffic, right? We've all driven in traffic. All right. Imagine if you're sitting in traffic with a 2-lane highway versus a 10-lane highway, right? Big difference. All right. So the more we have connections in the brain and we have strong neural pathways, the more highway systems we have in the brain, the easier it is for that brain to cross communicate effectively and efficiently. And at the end of the day, a coordinated body equals a coordinated brain, but a connected brain is a teachable brain. And that's something that is super important to think about. What we have for you guys tonight is we have this awesome handout. It will be in the chat. You'll also get an email about it. But this is a great handout to give teachers, to give family members, especially during the holiday season. If you're having a child that's struggling and you want to educate family members about what's going on, this is a great handout. It provides you some good information and definitions. It talks about the hypersensitivity versus hyposensitivity. And then it also gives you some great strategies for how to handle those stressful moments. We often encourage you to put together a sensory travel kit. There's certain smells that will help calm the brain down and activate more of that parasympathetic nervous system versus sympathetic. And then, of course, certain motor movements can also help with the regulation of sensory input. So this is a great handout for you to have that you can also get some really good tips on how to look at things from a neurological perspective versus a behavioral perspective. All right. Because it's not about just poor behavior. Many times, children that are having meltdowns and they're struggling, it's more related to how they're processing their senses. Now, here's the thing, when we ask ourselves, okay, what can we do? How do we strengthen brain connectivity? Well, remember how I talked to you from a developmental perspective that senses develop the brain, motor develops the brain. And so oftentimes at Brain Balance, we're really looking at where's your child's strength in brain function and where are their underdevelopments that's impacting the cross communication. And we want to focus on the underdevelopments. All right. But we're going to utilize more of a developmental approach where we're going to activate the brain through your child or your young adult's sensory systems. So auditory stimulation, visual stimulation, tactile stimulation, gross motor, fine motor exercises, balancing exercises, coordination exercises. Because again, all of that input can build connections in the brain, can build more highway systems in the brain. And that is the good news. The good news is that we can change the brain. We can build more connections in the brain, and a more connected brain, the less you will see in the sensory processing deficits. All right. They will be able to function better when that right and left hemisphere is cross communicating effectively and efficiently. You'll actually see them be able to function better in social situations, in in all of the different activities that you're doing. You'll actually see them be able to function better. But many times parents say, okay, how do I understand exactly what's going on with my child? And what I encourage you to do is get a comprehensive assessment at one of the brain balances. We can assess your child for those primitive reflexes that I was talking about. Do they have any active primitive reflexes that's impacting brain development and brain function? We can look at how their brain is processing the sensory systems, what their sensory perception is, what their processing is. We can really look at overall their visual system, their auditory system, their ability to smell, their ability to feel, because that gives us insight on how that brain is processing. We can also look at their motor skills, gross motor, fine motor, body awareness, looking at their coordination. We also can really assess their eye tracking and how their eyes connect to reading and reading comprehension. So the comprehensive assessment at Brain Balance really can give you really good insight on where there's strength in brain development and brain function and where there could be underdevelopments taking place that's impacting the cross communication of the brain. When we think about a child that's hypersensitive and hyposensitive, right? That's a sign and a symptom of an imbalance in the brain. And that is why you can see symptoms on both sides. You can see where one hemisphere, their left brain, can be hypersensitive. And so they can be very hypersensitive to certain sounds and touches and different things like that. And you can see other areas of the brain, more right hemispheric, where they can be undersensitive, hyposensitive. So getting answers specifically for your child through the assessment will be able to then put together a plan of action of how to bring better connectivity in the brain. So that is what I would suggest for you. We are offering a $50 off of the assessment tonight because you have watched the webinar. And what you can do is you can actually call the centers first thing in the morning to book an assessment. You can text them. We do have some directors that are on right now. And that is the first step. Is I would encourage you just to book the assessment and get answers specifically for your child, why they are struggling with sensory processing, where is their strength in brain function, and where there could be some underdevelopments that's impacting the cross communication of the brain. So we've got time for some questions, which is awesome. So share with me, I know we have some moderators on. What are some questions that our audience is asking tonight?
First off, we didn't have as many questions. So if you have questions now before we wrap up, please feel free to use the Q&A section to ask those questions as Amanda's going through the few that I do have. Amanda, we did have the question of what can cause a brain imbalance or what can cause a retained primitive reflexes. Can you give us a few examples?
Sure. So there's a lot of things that can cause an imbalance in the brain or some underdevelopments to take place or some retained primitive reflexes. Some common ones could be birth trauma, or a baby being born prematurely, or some weaknesses or difficulties in development in the first year of life. Environment also can impact development as well. So there's different environmental factors that can take place, as well as nutrition. There's a lot of different reasons why a child could struggle. There can be an epigenetic response. So there's not one specific reason why this could be happening, but the good news is that the brain can change. I encourage parents all the time, don't camp out in the why this happened, right? Let's just camp out in what do we do about it? Because time is of the essence, right? And we can change and improve the function of the brain. So let's focus our energy on improving the function of the brain, strengthening brain connections, building more brain connections, creating an environment that fosters positive brain development, and you won't have to worry about the past. You can focus on the present and you can focus on the future. And that's what I always encourage parents to do. So that's a great question.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have another question that was asking, is there a correlation between sensory processing and other diagnoses such as autism, ADHD? What is that correlation?
Sure. Well, let's think about that. If you really look at the diagnosis of autism or ADHD, it's really just a list of symptoms, right? So many times children can have symptoms of multiple diagnoses. And also, as they become older, and they're changing physically and they're just chronologically becoming older, their symptoms can change, which can also impact their diagnosis. But we're not so much focused on the symptoms as we're focused on addressing the root cause of why. And the root cause of why, the research shows that it's due to underconnectivity and a desynchronization in the brain. So if we focus on that, then we can actually do something about it. But it's very oftentimes, it's very prevalent for a child to have multiple diagnoses over a period of time as they grow. So, but if you really look at what does that mean, it really goes back to how that brain is processing. And when you have underconnectivity in the brain, it can cause a lot of the symptoms that are described in ADHD, autism, of course, sensory processing, and other things like that. Good question.
Awesome. We do have a live question or a question in the Q&A currently that is asking, is it harder to see results in older teenagers versus a younger child, and why?
Okay, I love this question. Okay, because the answer is if you have a young child, think about that their brain is young, right? And so there may be less underdevelopments per se. However, in the teenage brain, their brain is actually physically more developed. All right. So we actually can do things even faster because their brain is more developed physically. And so it's about building the connections in the brain. So in younger children, you may have less asymmetry or less underconnections taking place because they're younger, right? In older children, though, it actually works just as well because their brain is physically more developed. And so you can move a lot quicker. So honestly, A young child, it's great for them to get involved with brain balance. A teenager, it's great even in adulthood. I mean, that's the beauty of the study of neuroplasticity, is that we can change the brain throughout a person's entire life. But you can have just as much growth in teenagers as in young children, but for different reasons. And that's what I love about the brain and how fascinating it is, because I actually worked at a brain balance that was specifically at a residential boarding school for teenagers. And it was incredible the changes we saw. And I love working with teenagers. So it was a lot of fun. But younger children, right, they have less of an imbalance because they're younger and they haven't been struggling as long. So there are pros to both, but they're very different. And hopefully that's helpful for you to understand. Good question.
Thank you. We do have a question asking, once you enroll in the program, typically, when do you start to see progression or improvement?
That's awesome. That's a good question. Well, you're going to start seeing change within the first like 2 to 3 weeks, most likely. But your long-term goals, right? We have long-term goals and we have short-term goals. And so I often share with parents that yes, your long-term goals is better connections in the brain, better processing in the brain, to reduce the symptoms that you're seeing. However, we have to meet our short-term goals first. So your program director will share with you every month what you should be looking for, what changes you should be seeing, because those short-term goals will actually build a foundation to the long-term goals. So you absolutely will see change within the first few weeks, but you also have to understand that where we're looking for change, you have to see some foundational elements first before you're going to see the long-term goal. But all to say that when you're looking at those short-term goals and you're meeting them, it's so encouraging because you know that the long-term goal is right around the corner. So, but you'll see change within the first few weeks. Good question.
Thank you. Can you explain a little bit more about what a parent's responsibility is once they enroll in the program?
Well, have you ever heard the saying, it takes a village, right? We've heard that saying all the time. And the reality is it does. It takes a village. So we're going to have specific goals in the center that we're working on, and we are going to give you some at-home exercises and programming to do at home that's complementary or complementing what we're doing in the center. So you're working on certain things at home, we're working on certain things in the center. And so together, being on the same team, we're going to get your child or young adult where they need to be. But it absolutely does take both family at home and in-center staff to really be able to meet the needs of your child or young adult. We do have a variety of programs at this point. We have programs where there are in-center programs, there's at-home virtual programs. So there's a variety of programs today that's available. But no matter what program you choose to participate in, it takes all of us. It takes the team that's at Brain Balance as well as the family at home. And so environment fosters development. So we will be asking you to change some minor things in your home to create an environment that fosters positive brain development. And you'll feel empowered. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot of things that will foster and complement positive brain development. And that's empowering because as a parent, you will be able to learn how to look at things from a neurological perspective versus a behavioral perspective. And we're not just, I had a mom just tell me the other day, she said, I don't want to condition my child to do what I want them to do. I want them just to be able to learn from experiences and just be able to absorb their the world around them. And that's true. That's a very good statement. So all to say that it really helps empower you as the parent to be able to look at things from a neurological perspective versus a behavioral perspective. And you're going to feel more empowered, and you're going to see change by putting those interventions in place. I had a dad, this was a few weeks ago. He said, "Oh my goodness, one of our interventions is, doing smells with our kids." And sure enough, his daughter was in a meltdown and really struggling. And he pulled out his smell kit and had her do some smells, and she calmed down pretty quickly. And he said to me, he said, "Amanda, I'm not gonna lie, I thought that was a little weird, when you asked me to do smells with my child." He said, "But it works." He's like, "I couldn't believe how it shifted her brain out of fight, flight, or freeze and more into a place of calm." So again, activating the brain through their senses is really powerful. And so we educate you on that so you feel empowered as a parent. Good question. I think we have time for maybe one more.
We have a couple parents asking about support within school. For example, if a child is being bullied or if they need support academically. Can you elaborate how Brain Balance may be able to help them once they're in the program with that?
Sure. Well, every center will offer for you to give us permission to communicate with the school or communicate with the teacher. And so that is something that we offer as part of the program, because again, like I said, it takes a village, and teachers are with your children, many hours of the day. So their input is really important to us, but then also their ability to understand what you as a parent have chosen to do is also important. And honestly, a lot of times parents are really encouraged, or teachers are really encouraged when they hear that parents are taking some extra steps. So that's helpful for when they can hear, that you guys are doing some extra things. So we absolutely will and can communicate with the school and the teacher, and advocate for your child. And again, we just want to be a part of a team that sets your child up for success. So that's absolutely available. And most centers do offer that. And then related to academics, we do academic remediation. That is part of the program, because again, when you have underdevelopments in the brain and you have an imbalanced brain, it impacts, just like I said, it impacts school, it impacts the ability to learn. So as we get better connections in the brain and we get better processing in the brain, then the brain becomes more teachable. And so that's where you can do, academic remediation and tutoring. And that is part of the program as well. Good questions.
Thank you, Amanda. We do have a couple more coming in, but we are running out of time. Remember, there are texting numbers that are in the chat for you guys to be able to reach out to the center directly. They are going to be the ones that are best equipped to answer your personal questions about your children, give you the options that they have available within their center. So we definitely recommend for you guys to reach out to them via text or to jot down the number that you see on your screen right now, so you can call them first thing in the morning. They're ready to take your calls.
All right. Well, thank you so much for spending your evening with us. We are very thankful for that. And hopefully this was helpful. There is one last poll question at the end, if you'll feel free to please answer that. But again, thank you for joining us this evening. And I really hope that this has provided some good information, get you thinking a little bit more, and having a better understanding of what's going on in the brain of a child or a young adult that's struggling with sensory processing. So thank you for joining us. Have a great evening. And we do webinars every month on hot topics. Next month, it's all about behavior and understanding the brain of a child with behavior and ADHD. But again, thank you so much, and we will see you next month. Thank you, everyone.